As the sun rises and sets, so too do I return to elves after a long enough period of time. They're quite varied as it turns out, with a lot to talk about whether or not anyone cares to listen. But rather than just elves, today is a day to discuss the deities of the elves, those beings that guide their mortal children in the tumultuous world they live in. I've already talked about the Khaine, the elven/Eldar gods able to be said to be traditionally good. Not entirely, since aside from being based on the ancient Greeks, they're Warhammer gods and therefore perfectly capable of being tremendous jerks. But by and large, they're good deities looking out for their followers. This group does not do that. The Cytharai, as they are known, are the other side of the elven pantheon, for the elves do so love their duality in all things. They are not to provide guidance to those beneath them, not without a high price. They do not fight in support of their worshippers, not without a great deal of sacrifices of whoever can be found for them. And though this side of the pantheon certainly has less presence in 40k, they're no less fearsome and powerful deities when they are around. The darker side of the elven pantheon is one worshipped by the cruelest and most desperate, those who either view all others around them as lesser, or those who have lost all other options and so must crawl to these beings. But at the end of the day, they're elves, and so would happily kiss their feet for the slightest bit of attention. Let's see what they do, what their portfolios are, and just why they're all pretty damn awful. But before I begin, have you had a bite to eat yet today? If you haven't, how about I introduce you to Factor, the sponsor of this video. Now that summer's here, I imagine some people are going to be doing some traveling. I've been there, and you know what's sad after a vacation? Coming home to an empty fridge or one full of old rotting food. Well, good that Factor delivers chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals directly to your front door on a timely schedule. With no planning, cooking, or cleanup, all you gotta do is throw it in the microwave for 2 minutes, take it out, and enjoy. And they're well-balanced meals at that. Real ingredients, the macros are all balanced, and you get at least 2 veggies a meal to make sure that you're eating properly. I've been doing a bit of traveling myself lately, and even at home, I've had to drive back and forth between my home and visiting family for a few different occasions lately. With Factor, I can come right back home and just have a nice meal ready to eat. It's convenient, good food, and by God does it make coming back home and unwinding a lot easier than it otherwise could be. To get yourself some Factor, look no further. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code PancreasFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for 1 year. That's code PancreasFB50 at Factor75.com to get 50% off plus free breakfast for 1 year. PancreasFB50 at Factor75.com. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with quote and qualifying auto-renewing subscription purchase. We all gotta eat, so why not make the experience all the better with Factor. Now then, give praise to Khaine and slaughter your fellow elves. A large amount of these deities don't have a presence in 40k, at least directly, but there's the potential to have some of their influence in the setting. It's another byproduct of the elven gods being not only ported over from fantasy to 40k, but existing as nothing but background fluff to be devoured whole by Slaanesh during the fall of the Eldar. As for more general overviews, however, the Cytharai are, as I said, the evil gods. These are the deities that are the less savory part of the elf pantheon, and sure enough, the high elves tend to ignore them as much as possible. It varies from outright ignoring them, as stated, to trying to appease them only as much as they need to keep them from ripping Ulthuan apart in a fit. The Asur tend to be the nicer elves after all, and worshipping, say, the goddess who takes your soul and torments it for all eternity isn't exactly a popular move. And no, I'm not talking about Slaanesh, there's 2 of those in Warhammer Fantasy. Any equivalents they have in 40k meanwhile are likely equally disliked. After all, Asserman named himself after Asurian, and presumably you don't do that if you hate the god in question. Meanwhile, Jane Zar essentially told Khaine to get bent. They're done following him as anything but a beatstick to summon onto the field of battle sometimes. Presumably it'd be the same for the rest of the Cytharai if they existed over in 40k. The Dark Elves of Fantasy meanwhile revere the Cytharai. They're the evil elves, so they worship the evil gods. Arguments have been made that by each side essentially ignoring half of their deities, the elven race has become lesser for it by denying themselves. But at the same time, I'm gonna take the simplistic approach and say perhaps it's not a bad thing to cut out the part of your spirituality and soul that tells you to skin people. Maybe I'm removing some nuance, but you know in Warhammer, some gods shouldn't be worshipped. Sorry to make that bold claim that when you're Khorne but with less mutations, you probably shouldn't be worshipped by proper people. But Dark Elves aren't proper upstanding people. They ignore all the nice and kind gods and in turn worship the Cytharai to grant them power, which they usually in turn use to try and invade Ulthuan and kill the High Elves with. If you're wondering, by the way, why the Cytharai like getting elves killed in spite of being elven gods, then I really need you to focus back on the evil part. They're dicks, and since effectively half of the elven race is worshipping them still, they're content with what they have. Besides, in the Elven Civil War, whichever side wins would then be basically all of the elven race worshipping them for the most part, so they're happy playing the long game by giving the Druchii power. The risks are fairly low, and the rewards are becoming the only gods left to be worshipped by elf kind, so if that means getting some elves killed, then they're all for it. The Dark Eldar meanwhile don't worship any gods. They're pretty atheistic, all things considered, given their might makes right ideology that exists in the freakiest way possible. If the gods were so great, then why did Slaanesh eat them all? No, they don't take accountability for being the people that got their gods eaten, it's the Dark Eldar. Such things are beyond them. They might appreciate the Cytharai to some extent if they exist in 40k, and I believe they hold Khaine in reasonably high regard by virtue of him being the god of war and murder, but they aren't tossing him in praise in any frequent amount either, more so saying he's just the least bitch-made of them all. The Wood Elves in their traditional Wood Elf fashion are at least partially insane and worship both pantheons, including the Cytharai. Kurnos and Isha, both of whom are cat-eye gods, get the bulk of their worship, and Athel in itself is something they revere as well, but everyone else is equally in last place. Based on what they're doing at a given moment, they may give praise to certain members of the dark side of the elven gods, they may worship them for fun anyways, they may call them divine slurs and spite them if they can. They're Wood Elves, they're wacky and crazy, and sometimes eat Bretonnian peasants. It does mean that neither side of the pantheon has intense malice towards them, not especially anyways, but it also means that aside from specific instances, they aren't likely to give the Aserai many boons. Not that it means as much for them, given Athel protects them already, and Orion and Ariel are each incarnations of gods themselves, so they're hardly lacking in divine protection and guidance. And to round us off, the Exodites in 40k sure are there. Do they worship the Cytharai? Well, the issue with answering that is that there's two layers of not having lore with the question. There's the first layer of the Cytharai not really having lore in fantasy because all of the Eldar gods are less prevalent in fantasy, and there's the second layer of the Exodites themselves barely having lore. And what lore they have is rarely an in-depth look at their culture, but rather them getting their asses kicked, with maybe someone like Baelton being able to take revenge for the Space Wood Elves. Do they worship gods? Great question. I genuinely don't know. Probably to some extent just as cultural tradition or lip service, but they don't exactly have much lore to go on that isn't them getting ass blasted to oblivion. So with that rough overview, how about we get into the gods themselves? There's still a good amount of them on this side of things, but by and large they're less focused on than the nicer ones. That said, our first one is the Big K himself, the only one everyone worships even if some do it begrudgingly. The big red angry one, but with pointier ears than Khorne. He's the Elfdar god the average Warhammer fan is most likely to know about, albeit that tends to be because his reputation is in the toilet as far as 40k is concerned, and semi-deservedly so. A more full video on him can already be found on this channel, so I won't waste too much time here. I'm not that desperate for more content yet. But for completion's sake, we might as well talk about the fella at least a bit. Kayla Mencha Khaine, or Khaine the Bloody-Handed, is the elven god of war and murder. His domains naturally are when people are going to war and murdering each other, which incidentally means an assassin is equally valid as a Khainite than even the most daring and bloodthirsty of warriors. Both are equally valid to him as long as you're doing the killing in his name, and ideally are an elf. In 40k, Khaine is the butt of non-stop jokes due to how much of a jobber he is. He loses to Tyranids, he gets made fun of by the other Eldar, even if granted it was a Phoenix Lord doing it, he loses to Marnia's Calgar because Papa Smurf is the greatest of us all. For every victory he gets, and he does get victories such as against a Keeper of Secrets in a Caiaphas Cain novel, or against the Nightbringer itself during the War in Heaven, there's two embarrassing defeats to his name. It's not a shock that it's like this, or even something unique to him, because when you have a strong character that can also technically respawn, then of course every writer that needs to jerk off the protagonist is going to get that character killed, but it's still not a good look for him. In 40k we have the standard Eldar god background as well, so he's either a weapon that became a god, or a god that was uplifted along the Eldar by the old ones, or an old one himself, or who the hell even knows. There's like 50 different interpretations and tellings of how this shit went down. He would, in all cases, go on to just be awful, all around a terrible god. In no small part this is because of him shattering the Nightbringer. Supposedly before that he was an honorable war god, but after that he was infected with evil Necron juice and turned into a prick whose favorite hobby was killing Eldar. He killed untold amounts of them during the Eldar War in Heaven between their gods, because why not? To be fair, he did get a prophecy they'd kill him, and yes, he is a war god, so he's got a very specific set of skills, but you'd think there'd be at least one step between find out some Eldar are gonna kill you one day and total Eldar genocide. Much like the rest of the Eldar pantheon, he was also worshipped under different guises by other races. For instance, he's likely also the Hrud god Ka. Given that the Eldar ruled the whole galaxy, their influence, including their religion, likely spread all over the place. His time came to an end, sort of, with the rest of them, however. Slaanesh ate almost all the Eldar gods, but he was the exception. He was always mighty as a proper god, and he was able to duel Slaanesh basically to a standstill. And then Khorne got involved, said Khaine as a war god belonged to him, and then events differ based on how funny you want the situation to be. If you want a serious telling, Khorne and Slaanesh poured their essence into Khaine to claim him, and two Chaos gods' power was too much for even the Bloody-Handed. He fractured, shattering across reality and his shards entering the Materium, most prominently ending up in the heart of the Craft Worlds. If you want a funny retelling of events, Khorne used Khaine like a baseball bat to hit Slaanesh over the head with, and poor Khaine wasn't sturdy enough to tank that kind of abuse. Let no one say he didn't deserve it, though, since he also had a habit of tormenting his fellow Eldar gods such as Isha, Kurnos, and Val. Ever since then, he shows up as an avatar of Khaine, since killing a god is rather hard and the Eldar can summon him as they need. Killing his avatars, as discussed, is quite easy, narratively speaking, however. Those die all the goddamn time. Thanks for coming to the battle, Khaine. You suck. In fantasy, he's far more respected and of course a whole god, but he's primarily worshipped instead by the evil side of the Pantheon and the Dark Elf race. In fact, he's the chief god as far as the Dark Elves are concerned, taking the lion's share of their religious worship and granting them murderous boons in return. His primary influence on the world, aside from his legions of psychopathic witch elf followers, is the Widowmaker, or the Sword of Khaine. It's a murderous sword capable of granting immense power to its wielder, at the cost of driving them slightly utterly insane with power and cursing their entire bloodline. See Anarion and the other mess that are his children that eventually resulted in Tyrion, Teclis, and Malekith, of course. It can be a shorter story here because, to make it simple, he's the chief bad guy elf god. He gives the Druchii power, and he loves it when the elves kill each other. High elves do pray to him before a battle, and he is the only Cytharai with a statue in the Straits of Lothern, but aside from that, the High Elves ain't a fan of the guy. He's accepted begrudgingly, but no one is praying or sacrificing to him on a regular basis. Probably doesn't help he only ever brings potato salad to the barbecues in Avalorn, too. Come the end times, Tyrion became his avatar, and when Tyrion died, Khaine died. He could have resurrected in Age of Sigmar, but Morathi hijacked his worship and became a goddess herself with it. Chances are good that that's where his story ends in the fantasy side of things. Shame, but now we can move on from what has in many ways been me repeating what I've said before. Ereth Khial, also known as the Pale Queen. She, to give a bit of a spoiler, is kinda awful. For a quick rundown on Warhammer 40k, she's probably the deity of the elves least likely to have an Eldar equivalent. The Eldar used to be able to freely reincarnate. Even after Asuryan put up the barrier between the Immaterium and the Materium, they could still reincarnate. And Ereth Khial is the elven goddess of the afterlife, specifically the underworld. So her existence is a bit of a difficult subject because there wasn't really an Eldar afterlife, they just respawned. There's almost certainly some amount of Eldar permanently in their afterlife, but as you can likely see, that's a lot less important a job for a species that just comes back. Over in Warhammer Fantasy, meanwhile, there's 4 different options for a dead elf. The non-divine option is they can hang around a waystone as a ghost, protecting Oath One's network and maybe even giving advice to whatever random elf walks by. Option 2 is being grabbed by a patron god. Doesn't happen too often, but if you're a pious and good enough elf, it can happen. Option 3 is Slaanesh. Same general deal as in 40k, but in fantasy there isn't an inherent pull on elf souls that she has. She just likes them, she thinks they're neat. Option 4 is Ereth Khial, dragging their souls down to Morai, or the elven underworld. Rather interestingly, not only is she the queen of the underworld, but she's supposedly the head of the Cytharai and second only to Asuryan. But I assume the issue with that, at least among the Dark Elves, arises with her portfolio being death. Khaine's about making other people dead, whereas the Pale Queen is about the dead in general. If you're worshipping the goddess of the dead more than the god of making other people dead, you're probably a punk-ass bitch who's afraid he's gonna get stabbed, and so you deserve to be stabbed. So Khaine gets the attention more often. That said, she is still at least in second place, since the Dark Elves do view the torment she gives them as better than oblivion. She's by no means unpopular, Khaine's just the head of the Dark Elf religion. In all likelihood, she's still the head of things, at least in the divine realm. Khaine just gets the attention, and if anything, it's a symbiotic relationship. Khaine gets elves killed, she takes their souls to torment. That, incidentally, is why the High Elves don't like her much, because of all the tormenting she does to elf souls she gets her hands on. When the world began, she wandered alone in the dark before Asuryan brought light to the planet. She decided that she'd try and seduce him, maybe as thanks, maybe because she wanted to supplant him, or maybe because it had just been a hot minute. Either way, her advances were spurned, and in her rage over this, she steals elf souls and brings them to the underworld. There's even legends saying that if she gets pissed off enough, the dead will rise up, outnumbering the living and dragging them down too. Maybe that would have even happened had Nagash not shown up, eaten Asuryan in the end times, and maybe her too while he was at it. She does have worshippers amongst even the High Elves, though at best the practice is frowned upon, and a lot of her worshippers are more aptly termed appeasers. Her proper worshippers also tend to be pricks themselves, asking her to send her minions called the Raphalim Rephalem to steal the souls of people they don't like. Rephalem are basically just Nazgul for her, by the way, wraith-like creatures that work to keep her captured souls imprisoned. She's really hoping to grab Malekith's soul to use him as a general, but that ship's absolutely sailed given that nowadays he's a god in the sequel universe. Plus, if she did show back up in Age of Sigmar, Nagash would immediately beeline it for her so he could devour her soul like he did the rest of the death gods. Her presence was almost certainly felt during the end times when the souls of dead elves rose up during the battle between Tyrion and Malekith, but after that she promptly died with the rest of them, and that was that. Shame, because I love me a death deity, and she's one of those. Oh well, can't win them all. Eldyra, Tyrion's squire, was supposedly not only her reincarnation, as many of the elves turned out to be incarnations of elf gods, but ruled over her own subrealm in order to save as many elf souls from the end times as possible. And then she died, like I said. Elbozo rip. The Kadai god of the hunt is Kurnos, a nice-ish fella who might also be the human god Tal, or at least related to him. Anath Raema is the goddess of the savage hunt. Kurnos is all about noble hunters killing their prey and using every single bit of it, that sort of deal. Anath Raema is the goddess of ripping someone's throat out with your teeth and devouring their liver while they're still choking to death on their own blood. There's not as much lore on her as there are other deities, but for reference on what she's like, she's Khaine's sister. That's a red flag if I've ever heard of one. Not to pass the sins of the father onto the son, or of the brother onto the sister, but sometimes you can in fact make accurate judgments on people based on who they know and are related to. None of her portfolios beyond savage hunting are kind either. For instance, she's also the goddess of jealous lovers. This is because she tried to get herself with Kurnos, only to be rejected in favor of Isha. So if you find yourself jealous because someone you're pining after got with someone else, just pray to Anath Raema. She'll send her hunters after that asshole and you can slide in on the rebound. Primarily though, you can find her followers in the city of Clark-Harrond and Nagaroth, the chief shipbuilding area of the Dark Elves. Her followers actually outnumber Khaine's there, and they believe, likely accurately, that her savage blessings guide them when they go to war. While I'm unsure if it's ever been outright written down, she might be one of the few elven deities the Wood Elves outright dislike. After all, they love Kurnos and Isha, and Kurnos and Isha don't like Anath Raema, so by the transitive property, maybe they also don't like Anath Raema. On that note, however, and I ask you to take this with a grain of salt because I couldn't find where I originally read this lore blurb, every now and again Orion/Kurnos might have a bit of a fling with her. When this happens, Ariel gets into an understandably bad mood and things tend to be a bit dour and Athel Lauren. Divine infidelity is hardly surprising. I mean, how often was Zeus cheating on Hera after all? Oh, and Anath Raema also killed the father of dragons Dragnir, supposedly because she was jealous of him spending time with a Surian. It's occurring to me, as I'm writing this, that they really made a whole goddess out of the concept of a psycho ex-girlfriend, didn't they? At least we have the most likely candidate for a fan of the All-American Rejects in Warhammer. Lord knows Gives You Hell has gotten me through some rough relationship moments. Anath Raema isn't the most nuanced of deities. Kill people you're jealous of, especially if they're porking someone whose junk you want in your mouth, and she'll like you. Organize the most savage hunt on a fellow sapient being you can think of, and she'll really like you. Organize a continent-wide manhunt on the guy who beefed your wife, and you'll probably become her champion. Simple as. And here we come to an immediate hurdle, because she's not Cytharai, or Cat-Eye. She's our own little being, on average usually grouped closer to the Cytharai, but from my understanding, that's more so because that's the best anyone can do. Realistically, she's her own special little thing, as is befitting Morai-Heg, the goddess of fate. If you've ever seen the archetype of the mother, maiden, and crone, she's the crone to Lilia's maiden and Isha's mother. She's the goddess of fate proper, not just prophecy, and she's a mysterious little bugger to say the least. First of all is that apparently in either of the Warhammer settings, she's incredibly old even by warp god standards. She's ancient, and her knowledge is vast. All of fate is to some extent in her hands, and in a very Zinchian way there's the occasional hint that everything that happens can be traced back to her. This works the same way as it does with all other Warhammer beings that can supposedly perfectly predict fate, such as Tzeentch. If you take them at their word, you're taking liars at their word, so try not to take it too literally. Not to say you shouldn't be wary of her. No small amount of beings, including gods themselves, owe her at least some amount of debt, and she will collect. And in a shocking twist of fate, I actually can talk about her in 40k, would you look at that. Morai-Heg there is still old as hell, and one of her earlier myths is having Khaine cut off her hand on her request. There was a reason for it. She wanted to drink her blood to gain the knowledge inside of it, and Khaine was the only one powerful enough to do it. You may have questions like, how the hell does that even work? Or, if the knowledge is in her blood, why doesn't she already have it? These are good questions, to be sure. I don't have answers. But anyways, her method of doing this was to send her armies of banshees after her. Morai-Heg has literal banshees as her followers and servants, and in fact are what the howling banshees are named after. Of course, Khaine is Khaine, and so was beyond their power to harm, but not their power to annoy. And a banshee's wail is a well-known thing. So yes, the goddess of fate, one of the most powerful and knowledgeable beings in the cosmos, got Khaine to cut off her hand by having her kids scream in his ear non-stop until he got so annoyed he just gave in. Supposedly, she also may have had a brilliant solution to the issue of the fall of the Eldar with Slaanesh's birth, which she didn't predict, but when it became obvious, she came to the rescue. Hope the mortal Eldar can figure something out. Fantastic work. And even then, that might be giving her too much credit, because this might have been more so Asuryan asking in general, what is the fate of the gods, rather than what the hell are we doing about this Slaanesh problem that's brewing. To cut her a little bit of slack, she is the goddess supposedly credited with giving foresight to the Eldar, which is basically the only thing keeping them alive. And the knowledge that wisdom comes with sacrifice, which is rather more of a Hallmark Channel nothing phrase, but I guess it's something. Beyond that, she must have been at least vaguely helpful throughout Eldar history on a consistent basis, because not only are the former Eldar homeworlds named after her, called Crone worlds, but even today they still hold that cutting the strand of life that connects a person to their soul is something only she has the right to do. That's why they hate using weapons like certain Wraithguard weapons or Hemlock Wraith fighters. Those things target your soul, and that is something firmly in the realm of the divine, not for mortals. She may have even saved the Eldar race, potentially. While the Banshees used to be her and Khaine's children, making the whole screaming for hand amputation thing even funnier incidentally, in newer lore they become the children of her and the death god yet to be, aka Inniad, who supposedly was unformed but still able to interact with the universe, and his birth may have potentially been hijacked by Slaanesh. Her severed fingers, meanwhile, were forged into 5 utterly unmatched swords, save perhaps by the final one Vol created for the war in heaven. They were scattered throughout the Eldar Empire to be used when they were needed most, and contained the power of her unborn husband-to-be. These, of course, are the Crone swords the Ynnari so desperately want, which they will never get because Ynnari, but still, props to Morai-Heg for this bit. She didn't do anything wrong, if anything that's quite wise. I'd argue that goes a long way in making her a proper goddess of fate. Scattering swords forged from her bones across the Empire for when they're most needed seems like the sort of thing that kind of deity would do. It even makes Eldred look like less of a cock-up. Those swords were supposed to save the Eldar and needed Inniad to be awakened to work properly. If Inniad wasn't supposed to be summoned into being by the mortal Eldar, then why would the Crone swords work the way they do? Or why, indeed, would she say that the fate of the gods was tied to the mortal Eldar? She's still in Slaanesh's gut though, so don't expect much out of her directly nowadays. Over in fantasy, meanwhile, she's more prevalent, but less important in a few ways. Her aspect as the goddess of fate is unchanged, so she undoubtedly has plenty of influence amongst divinity. In fact, no one aside from other gods has ever seen her, something basically unheard of in Warhammer. Even they don't see her terribly often, both because she's busy with her own designs and she's apparently easily irritated. Not anger, it should be said, but passively aggressively getting my fate toyed with sounds worse in some regards, so I wouldn't mess with her. Much like Asuryan, she also knows the fate of all elves. Unlike Asuryan, she also knows the fate of every other mortal as well, or at least it said she does. She keeps these fates in a runic pouch on her waist, which is something I don't even want to try to explain or understand how that works. None of the elves worship her as a beloved figure of their pantheon, but they don't outright dislike her either, at least in the sense of viewing her as the Dark Elves do the Kadai, or the High Elves the Cytharai, which is with contempt and fear. Fate tends to be the kind of thing people both want to steer clear of, but also need to pay some respect to, depending on if it's on their side or not, especially in not only a fantasy setting, but a fantasy setting where there's another god of fate and it's goddamn Tzeentch. It's a thing that understandably you want on your side if you can help it, and so all elves give some amount of lip service to her. The Asur do it in hushed whispers, and the Druchii do it in private so as not to be seen as weak, but everyone's aware that she's got some influence on their life, and so she gets prayers. Plus she can rearrange the stars apparently, which usually messes with fate given celestial magic and all that, meaning that in theory you could convince her to change your fate. Ravens are a creature that supposedly do her bidding in the mortal world. High Elven archers will firmly tell people not to mess with ravens, and if you accidentally hit one or even see a dead one, you should pay respects to it immediately. She's a feared goddess here, understandably so. The end times came and went as they did, however, with her going down, but unlike most of the Elven pantheon, she wasn't out. Slaanesh devoured her as in 40k, but unlike 40k, Morai-Heg wasn't going to be played for a fool here. Early on, even in the Age of Myth, Morathi's control over the daughters of Khaine was an ironclad. clad. Seers and worshippers of none other than Morai-Heg had cropped up, and despite Morathi's best efforts to crush them, they kept coming back. Whether it be because of her own brutality sowing dissent, or because the followers of a fate deity being able to figure out how to stick around, Morai-Heg worship was never quite quelled. These worshippers, known as the Knights of the Crone, worship Morai-Heg and Khaine in equal parts, but decry Morathi as a false prophet, and later on, a false goddess. Morathi's own ascension is what has actually caused them to gain more legitimacy. Though she did indeed become a proper goddess through her siphoning of souls and Khaine's own divine heart, her action doing it caused just a sliver of Morai-Heg's own power to break free of Slaanesh. It became part of someone known as Cairn of Vix, and while to my knowledge there hasn't been too much happening with it yet, the Daughters of Khaine have become more fragmented than ever before after Morathi's ascension. She may now truly be a goddess, but her schemes have been revealed, and now a portion of another goddess already being worshipped has been freed. Morai-Heg herself may not be around anymore, but come on now. She's a deity whose portfolio is prophecy and fate. Do you really think someone like that can't play the long game for as much time as needed to ensure that once again all the gods dance to her tune? We have some deities with a shorter segment here after that dump. Hekarti is the Cytharai goddess of magic. Specifically, however, she's the goddess of dark magic, with some dabbling in conjuration specifically for that extra bit of spice. What this means, practically, is that when it's time to summon a demon to fail at making a deal with the devil, she's the goddess you pray to first. Of course, having said that, she's surprisingly easy to deal with. As a goddess of dark magic, she of course demands a price be paid for her favor and any knowledge or power she grants you, but up front it's clear that whoever pays that price doesn't matter. So if you can gather yourself a few sacrifices, and the Dark Elves being slavers that is anything but difficult, you can get yourself a nice power boost at no cost to yourself beyond whatever effort it took to acquire your sacrifices. Evil, to be sure, but it's kind of refreshing to see that, and it is an honest business transaction in many ways. The price tends to grow larger the longer the deal you made with her goes on, but again, Dark Elves. They were taking slaves anyways. If the cost for a magical boon goes from 10 dead slaves to 15 dead slaves, they'll do it in a heartbeat. And if you fail, it's hardly like more Dark Elves aren't going to come to her for power in the future. They'll just call whoever failed weak and make deals with her themselves, confident in the knowledge that while almost everyone else eventually has their fate catch up with them, they're simply built different and will be able to fulfill their side of the bargain indefinitely. Introspection is not a common trait in Dark Elf society, no. What also helps is that she's in a constant sibling rivalry war with her twin sister Atharti, so if you can convince Hekarti that by giving you power you can snub her sister for her, she'll probably give you a hell of a discount. Atharti is the Cytharai goddess of pleasure, seduction, hedonism, all that lovely stuff that might make you think, wait a minute, isn't that Slaanesh's thing? And you're absolutely right, she's basically non-chaos elf Slaanesh. From a meta perspective, I believe this was because the authors at GW didn't want elves outright worshipping Slaanesh, apparently deciding that the Eldar way of doing things must be applied to fantasy as well. But in-universe, I don't see this being a shocker, or that Atharti is a secret front for Slaanesh. It seems only fitting, if nothing else, that the concept of excess has multiple deities behind it. She's not the most expanded upon of gods, though she does count amongst her most fervent followers those dark elves that try and infiltrate Ulthuan. Who better than a pleasure goddess to convince a stuck-up high elf to let loose after a long day, right? And she did create the blood-rack Medusa after a bunch of sorceresses tried to become more beautiful than the gods themselves, and she struck them down for their hubris, so she does have her moments of direct and powerful divine intervention. Atharti and Hekarti's non-stop sibling war with each other is outright murderous in intent, because they just don't like each other and want the other's followers. To point out the obvious, yes, plenty of Dark Elves do try and take advantage of this. This usually ends with a horrifically tortured Dark Elf having their soul obliterated, because I believe about the only time these two sisters get on with each other is when they punish someone for trying to play the gods for fools. Usually any Dark Elf worships and sacrifices to them both in equal measure, because while you don't get superpowers and favors for that, you also don't get turned into a Gorgon. Morathi is pretty much the only one to successfully court them both, assuming we aren't in an edition where she worships Slaanesh, and even then she always had to be careful. Hekarti tends to be pretty outright banned in High Elf society, but Atharti is slightly more accepted. More so in a, she represents a dark part of us, so we should appease her kind of way, but that's still more than most. She doesn't have any fancy statues of herself on Ulthuan, of course. Khaine's the only Cytharai with that pleasure, but there's an acknowledgement to some extent, bitter though it may be, that the Dark Elves are still elves, and so Atharti's presence could corrupt the Asur as it does the Druki. Best to appease her in small ways when possible, and if that's not enough for you, there's still plenty of pleasure cults on Ulthuan outright worshipping her. As for the end times, I'm not sure who or even if Atharti had an avatar like a lot of the other elf gods, but Hekarti's avatar was, to the surprise of no one, Morathi. The chief dark sorceress turned out to be the chosen elf to inherit the dark elf sorceress god's powers. Who would have thought? This does make Age of Sigmar more interesting in a way that writers have, to my knowledge, not done anything with, however. Perhaps Morathi could have achieved an alternate method of godhood, since at least some of Hekarti's essence was flowing through her veins. Alternatively, maybe it was that very fact that allowed Morathi to be able to ascend at all, and why even pre-divinity in AOS she was still a powerful being. The whole Medusa thing in AOS has been turned into a result of Slaanesh corruption, but with Hekarti's power in there, even if buried deep, it could be why so many corrupted elves have that manifest as Gorgon status. Or it could just be that the writers have forgotten about and/or ignored everything along Hekarti's lines. Hardly the first time that's happened in Warhammer, an answer as unsatisfying as it is common. I'm rather confused on her viewer, and her section won't be long because of it. You see, Ladrielle is the Lady of the Lake. I'll rip the band-aid off now. That elven goddess pretending to be a human one for the sake of creating super soldier Bretonnian knights. She got away with this by appearing fairly infrequently, the fact that Ladrielle is the Lady of the Mists and rather mysterious for that divine title, and because, at least I imagine, the first thing someone does when meeting a god isn't to check their ears for how pointy they are. There's probably a lot more awe involved, as much as Carillion and Vermintide makes fun of Marcus Kruber for not doing that exact thing. Her portfolio sure enough is illusion, mists, and more, and then confusion sets in more because as far as I understand things, she's a Cytharai, the evil side of things, and yet she spends most of her time protecting high elves, especially those prone to wanderlust and adventure. That's not an evil thing to do, and it makes me wonder if she's even a Cytharai or only technically categorized as such because the high elves love duality and there were too many cat-eye otherwise. Or maybe it's just because as a goddess at least somewhat related to illusions, there's not quite as much trust in her as there otherwise could be. And to make matters worse, those of you familiar with the end times might be shouting that Ladrielle isn't the Lady of the Lake, that's Lilith. Correct. Ladrielle technically doesn't exist, she's just an aspect of Lilith. But when gods are being discussed, how fake Ladrielle is as a deity is an open-ended question. It makes me think of the Roman gods from the Percy Jackson sequel series, and how they're the same beings as the Greek gods, but also basically different people, which Mars himself brings up in response to, I believe it was Percy talking about Ares being a shitbag. They could be the same being, but with different personalities, divine domains, and even in some ways different spirits. But alternatively, Lilith in the end times was revealed to be a turbo manipulator, so the entire time it very much could be as simple as Ladrielle being nothing but a mask. No one ever saw her face, even despite the fact that Ladrielle was freely able to go between the mortal world and the divine. And also, this could technically mean Ladrielle exists in 40k if they're both the same person, since Lilith is at least moderately important to Eldar lore too. I don't know. I don't know if I want to know. This whole affair is a mess and doesn't properly fit into neat little categories, and that bothers me. Let's move on to someone simpler. Aside from sounding like Shakira, Drakira is known as the Queen of Vengeance. She was originally an unassuming deity, and in another section we'll discuss part of her origins a bit more because it ties in with several other gods. But originally, she was fairly weak. In spite of her name, she wasn't a mighty god, cleaving bloody paths of retribution like Kratos. She wasn't powerful at all, not really, but she was clever. She saw Isha weeping, knew that this goddess was both kind but capable of great wrath born of her grief, and stoked her grief even more. With Drakira's whispers in her ear, Isha grew more and more distraught until her grief turned to action. And with the events Drakira set in motion, over 100 gods were slaughtered by their father. Those who remained knew that Drakira was at least in part responsible, and the runt of the litter suddenly became a lot more respected. Vengeance, as it turns out, doesn't need to be a bright flame scorching all on its way. It can be patient, as Drakira was. And while the rampaging monster is a threat in an obvious way, the quiet goddess in the corner can wreak far more havoc with a few choice words into the right mortal at the right time. Drakira is of course viewed favorably by the Dark Elves, who believe she takes their side in things, and as a Cytharai, the High Elves don't pay her any more respect than they feel necessary to avoid her wrath, but in truth she doesn't favor any one side more than the others. Even the Wood Elves aren't getting any special favors because vengeance isn't something that's unique to one side of the Elven race. Be it a High Elf wanting vengeance against Black Art raiders stealing their family, a Dark Elf noble seeking to reclaim his ancestral birthright of Ulthuan, or even a Wood Elf trying for retribution against a dwarf incursion, all of these things count as vengeance. All of them give her power. All of them are worship as far as she's concerned. If she did exist in 40k, she'd be in Slaanesh's gut. Perhaps more than any other devoured god, her influence would remain. If she is canon there as well, I can imagine Baelton taking a liking to her. After all, those foolish lesser races that inhabit maiden worlds need to be taught a lesson on who rightfully rules the galaxy. And those who do something as horrid as destroying a world inhabited by Exodites will be brought to heel and show that the Eldar may be diminished, but they're by no means lesser. And with that, I imagine that Drakira's gifts and lessons would be something they'd be all too happy to enact on whatever foolish Imperial or Chaos warlord decided to encroach on rightful Eldar territory that day. This guy really doesn't have much going for him, at least as far as discussing him goes. He's the son of Ereth Khial and is the gatekeeper of the elf underworld. He makes sure everything is safe and sound, and no souls are being siphoned away until the Rana Dandra comes to pass, which, yes, that's something that exists in both 40k and fantasy. He does theoretically allow that to happen if proper sacrifice to his mom are made, which opens the door for a slightly less horrific version of necromancy to be possible in Warhammer, but realistically it doesn't really do much. When your entire divine portfolio is glorified gatekeeper, there's not much to say. His symbol is funny though, not because it's anything special, but because there's legend that if you draw it on someone's house, he'll slowly steal away the inhabitant's soul. Dark Elves like to do this to people on Oathwan in secret, and from my reading, I can't tell if it actually does that, or if this is just a religious-based prank. Maybe your soul actually does drain away, and this is another of many nefarious Dark Elf plots. Or maybe they just like watching the Asur shit their pants when they realize what that graffiti on their door actually is. Either way, this is the most interesting thing about Nethu. He's not even a proper Cytharai. Of the rest of the gods I'm going to mention, most of them actually aren't. I just don't know where else to put them. Onto them we go, I suppose. To save some time, all these dicks can be grouped together. These are technically not Kadai or Cytharai for the most part, and in fact neither side of the elven race really likes them. Wood Elves is always a potential exception, because the Wood Elves do not care for anything but trees and making situational best friends and worst enemies. To tell the story in a bit more detail that I mentioned earlier, there exists in fantasy a god called Ellinill. He was a god of destruction and disaster, so powerful that everyone, even the likes of Khaine and Assyrian, feared him at least a little bit. It is also said, in addition to that, he apparently fucked like a madman because he had over 100 kids. Together, he and his children were known as the Ellinill, which is a silly and fun name to say, and they loved nothing more than being colossal destructive pricks across the world. Ruin a city here, carve a new canyon in a landscape there for no other reason than they wanted to. They were monsters. Each of them supposedly embodied one aspect of his own portfolio, kinda like the Primarchs, but when you have over 100 kids, I feel like there's gotta be some overlap, or things started getting really specific. Like one guy is the god of burning down orphanages, while the other is the god of burning down homeless shelters or something like that. Ellinill was proud of his children, but also a paranoid bastard. He knew that individually he could stomp any one of his kids flat, but when you get over 100 gods ganging up on someone, even someone like him might falter, so he always had an eye out for treachery. And then, enter Isha and Drakira, his weakest daughter. Since mortal elves were equally valid targets for this guy and his kids as any other, she was understandably sad at how often they were dying to their rampages. She grew sadder and sadder, with Drakira's whispers only inflaming those feelings until eventually they turned into action. She demanded someone finally put a stop to his rampage, and while almost every other god awkwardly looked the other way while whistling and checking their non-existent wristwatches, the god Loic intervened. He took a simple course of action. All he did was tell the paranoid Ellinill that the betrayal he always feared had come, and his children were preparing to kill him. So in response, he rampaged across the heavens themselves, killing them one by one. Countless of the gods were slain, but the process weakened Ellinill too. His powers diminished to a point where they never reached their full heights once again, but the damage was done. Almost none of his kids survived. Only a few managed it. Mithlan, the god of the seas, and actually a Kadai, Eldrazor, god of battle, Drakira, queen of vengeance, Adioth, the all-consuming flame, Ukon the sunderer, and Estruth, god of drought. Then really, none of his kids beyond Drakira need much more focus on their own. That and Mithlan, but I already talked about him in another video since he's a Kadai. Eldrazor is a god of battle, so finds worshippers in plenty of places. It's Warhammer, remember? Estruth is a god of drought and famine, and I can't find it in myself to write too many funny things about starving to death. Just not much material to work with, kind of like anyone who pisses this guy off doesn't have much food to work with. Hukan causes earthquakes, which is destructive to be sure, but there's also not much with them. Don't piss him off, or the start of the movie 2012 will happen to you. Drakira I talked about, and Adaeth is a bit interesting, but only slightly. Unlike a lot of his siblings, he met his father head-on, since he's a prideful bastard. He knew he couldn't win, but he also couldn't allow himself to run. Before his father killed him, however, Ladrielle/Lilia spirited him away. He never forgave her for that in the same way Vegeta at one point got pissy about Goku saving his life. Ever since, he spent his time forging weapons, armor, and likely gaining whatever worshippers he can in preparation for his inevitable rematch with his father. He's also a volcano god, which in many ways is unrelated, but being related to fiery magma is fitting for such a prideful deity. All of the Ellinill now live in the mortal world. In theory, they could go back to the heavens, but none of them want to because Daddy Dearest would kill and maybe eat them if they did. Rather sad, but their backstory is them causing so much havoc Isha weep tears of rage, so I don't feel all that bad about it. And that was the darker side of the Elven Pantheon of Warhammer, with a bit of 40k in the Eldar appearing for funsies and engagement bait. Praise Khaine, for when you need someone stabbed, there's few better options to pray to, unless you don't mind mutating a hell of a lot. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Cytharai to my Elven Pantheon, the dark side that nonetheless is an integral part of this whole affair. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Yes, here it is. This is an elf episode. I would do terrible things in the name of getting a whiff of Atharti's armpit sweat. You all know what I'm about. My dick has taken me to places I wouldn't go with a gun, and Nagaroth is certainly on the list of places I'd let it take me next.